Hello, I'm David Morris. Well, the sky is changing. We are going through this period of change in the 2020s in the global economy, in geopolitics, in our own national politics all over the world, in technology and of course climate change. And one of the central questions is, can we build and sustain a pragmatic interdependence with China, or as some geopolitical analysts are telling us, must we be seeing the rise of China as a threat? These are the questions that I have looked at deeply over the last few years in researching, in interviewing for my book, A New Era of Risk, which I'm going to read from today. I've had many people who've read it, but I've also had many who've said, why don't you do a podcast, or why don't you read your book? So I'm going to start reading from the preface today, which is my introductory comments to why I came to write this book and some of my personal observations. Later, I'll look forward to reading the chapters of the actual book itself, which are based on my PhD research that I did on this question of how might we construct a sustainable internationalism, a way to have sustainable interdependence with China. So I'm going to put my glasses on and I'm going to read you the first few pages from my preface to the book today, and I hope you find this of interest. The sky is changing. Nobody really knows how the international order, business environment and everyday life will evolve after these seismic disruptions that are underway in the 2020s. Risk has become the new normal. After nearly 4 decades as a practitioner, either in international relations or in politics, including in particular more than 3 decades of professional interaction with China, this book has been a long time coming. I hope it will be of some practical value and might point to the need for some fresh thinking about how we can manage risks, understand each other better, and find a way towards a more sustainable internationalism. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that later. First, after I take a glass of water, first some personal reflections in these introductory remarks are required to provide full disclosure so that the reader can assess my personal experiences and perspectives that no doubt influence the chapters that follow. Conscious of the likelihood that my personal experiences and perspectives might unduly influence the doctoral research that underpinned this work, I deliberately travelled as far away from the overwhelming normative China discourse that had emerged in my home country of Australia at the time that I was writing this book of a few years ago. And I also travelled as far away as I could from China to write this book in the centre of Europe. I have avoided in this book, apart from the occasional relevant reference, matters in which I myself was a participant, such as in Australia-China relations and in Pacific Islands-China relations. Bias is inherently difficult to purge from any kind of research because it is often axiomatically unconscious. From living in a number of dramatically different cultures, I believe I've cultivated at least a sincere, if possibly never entirely successful, intention to remain aware of contested narratives and different perspectives on subjects that often polarize scholars and decision makers alike, and that lead us to assert certainties, such certainties sometimes stoking confrontation and conflict. I have seen enough confrontation and conflict to believe it is worth applying human empathy and intelligence to finding ways to build peace and cooperation instead. Empathy requires sometimes jumping out of our own comfort zone and walking in another's shoes. Returning to Hungary as my base for the research that underpins this book, after 3 decades since my first stint there as a young Australian diplomat, brought back memories of the flush of optimism after 1989 amongst observers from the so-called West that peace, liberal democracy and market-oriented political economies would flourish in these new geographies, beyond the very small number of countries that until that time had constituted the so-called liberal international order. I was as enthusiastic as everyone else that European integration might help secure peace, but I was sceptical that the transition to liberal democracy and marketisation would be smooth, especially if it was pursued ideologically by elites rather than built from the ground up. So I went back to Hungary, in the centre of Europe, to be as far away from Australia, where at the time, a few years ago, there was a very dominant narrative around China threat. I also travelled as far away as I could from China, where again I thought that I might have been too influenced by the growing confidence within China. So I went to the centre of Europe and to a place, Hungary, that's kind of at the borderline between East and West. It's a place where new narratives are forming, sometimes ethno-nationalist narratives that don't make me too comfortable, but sometimes it's a good thing to go outside your comfort zone. So I wrote here in my preface, living in Hungary again these past few years has underscored what I have observed in many places, that empirical lived experience matters and that grand theories can sound very convincing at certain junctures to both participants and outside observers, but can prove disappointing over time if they are expected to provide some linear guide to the future. So when I went back to Hungary to do this PhD research, I met a geopolitical analyst who'd written books. He was an American. He'd written books about the decline, how Japan would crash and how China would crash. And so I asked him, I said, how much time have you spent in those countries to have written these books and to have predicted the future crash of these economies? He hadn't been to either of them. So I think that says it all, really. Things change. Other things stay the same, but nobody has yet figured out how to predict accurately which things will change and which will stay the same. Lived experience in different cultures is a rich complex of elements that we may inevitably perceive as either positive or negative, but which are more likely mutually constitutive. Living in a foreign environment can open the mind, if it is open to being challenged in the first place. Living in a foreign environment facilitates a deep engagement and awareness of local dynamics, a level of understanding that I've observed helps to inform political risk, research and analysis, but appears sometimes to be lacking in these grand theories of international relations that have usually been written at the centre of a ruling empire rather than in the borderlands intersecting between imperial influence and the other nations of the world where most of the global population lives. So as a relatively privileged global citizen, life has been good to me, as I have lived at various times in Europe, in China, in the United States, and of course in Australia, my home country, in between, where I have had the good fortune to have a relatively unique vantage point from which to observe the commonalities and differences in challenges many people and organisations face, at the same time as the opportunities they have before them. Perhaps it helps that I've always been an optimist rather than a cynic, having seen how human agency can address challenges. And as a diplomat, I was a cheerleader for international engagement, for cross-cultural understanding and all the complicated negotiation and construction that is necessary to arrive at mutual benefits. The recent decades of peace and transformative economic development in East Asia, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, appears to justify optimism. Nevertheless, I have long been only too aware of how everything fails sometimes, from observing as the former Yugoslavia descended into the hell of ethno-nationalist warfare in the 1990s while I worked at the time in the Australian Embassy in Budapest. In 1993, on my return from my first period of living in Budapest, working there in the Australian Embassy, when I returned back to the Foreign Affairs headquarters in Canberra, I became United Nations Peacekeeping Desk Officer. I was responsible for drafting policy advice on Australia's participation in peacekeeping operations at a time when UN member states were grappling with whether the post-Cold War exponential growth of peacekeeping could be sustainable and more strategically deployed, including to prevent conflict and to build post-conflict peace. I worked on a team researching and drafting Gareth Evans's book called Cooperating for Peace. That book, by the way, was highly acclaimed around the world in its time. In that book, the argument that Gareth Evans made was around cooperative security, and cooperative security requiring proportionate measures for the spectrum of security challenges, and that these security challenges spanned human security, economic security, and other factors as well. It was an initiative parallel to the same government, this is in the Hawke-Keating governments in Australia, the same government's attempts to support the rapidly developing complex interdependence in the Asia-Pacific, with new regional architecture, such as APEC, for example, to embed what my minister, Gareth Evans, used to evocatively call habits of dialogue. China, at this time, was busy rejuvenating itself with its market reforms and was front and centre of our attention, at least in what we called then the Asia Pacific, and certainly in Australia. And certainly my recollection that we in Australia in the 1990s had a good understanding of how China was likely to develop, and we did not have the naive expectation that some in other countries in the world had, that China would somehow westernise as it modernised. That was something I never remember any Australian expert ever discussing. As Asia got richer, Australia got even richer. So this engagement in Asian supply chains was very successful for Australia. To make it all sustainable, we knew we needed to also build regional security. We embarked on a grand experiment to manage both security and international economic interdependence in a complex set of interlocking strategies, with Australia the first country, I believe, to merge its departments of foreign affairs and trade, in the year actually that I joined by chance. That was a path subsequently followed by small and middle-sized countries around the world, with the conviction that economic and strategic interests can and must be managed holistically, whether the international relations literature, most of which emits from the US and other centres of power where economic and strategic interests are managed quite separately, can integrate understanding of economic and strategic interests without privileging geopolitics, is another matter. Then there is domestic politics, which to me always seemed to be part of the often overlooked story of international relations. Integrating with Asia had its challenges for Australia, not least in the cleavage it created domestically between those who were deeply engaged with the diversity of Asia, such as business people, academics, and the government of that time, and they were referred to sometimes as elites, and the cleavage with others, whose understanding of Asia perhaps was gleaned from holidays in Bali or media narratives that often exoticize Asia through Western, predominantly English-speaking eyes. I first visited Hong Kong in 1973 as a 9-year-old, in the days when there was no talk of either democracy or communism, but rather Hong Kong had a blend of authoritarian colonialism and unfettered free market. That was ruling the day, with dismal sweatshops jostling side by side with luxurious bankers' clubs. It was complexity in open view, and it was much closer to home for me as an Australian than culturally dominant but distant Britain and America. Then at the turn of the century, after those Hong Kong sweatshops moved across the border, as well as, of course, plenty of luxurious clubs, I began regularly visiting mainland China, accompanying trade delegations whose members were securing lucrative deals to export iron ore, coal, beef, lobster, wine, and, of course, education, all a part of Australia's massive trade surplus with China. Again, we saw the complexity of rapidly changing Asia. Some aspects exciting and other aspects deeply troubling. We were entertained lavishly and subjected to long monologues on the win-win benefits for Australia if we deeply partnered with China. I took to enjoying my right of reply to also wax lyrical about mutual benefits, while diplomatically pointing out that we may nevertheless have different perspectives on some questions because of our different national experiences and interests. These points were always acknowledged, and I don't recall ever being coerced to take a particular position. Although, to be sure, there were many occasions when my interlocutors expressed bafflement at why Australia persevered with its alliance with the US, when, according to them, its interests were so obviously in closer friendship with China. I always argued that we could do both, and I always believed it. As international relations and international business appeared to me to be a balancing act between competing interests and risks to be managed together. This view was widely shared amongst my peers, all practitioners in the business of building international cooperation. I've maintained wide networks with colleagues in and from China, and I do not accept the currently fashionable view that maintaining such networks exposes me to coercion or bias. Where I did encounter coercive attempts to change my mind once was on a US State Department International Visitor Program tour in 2002. Part of the program was a week of appointments that I had in Washington during the height of the debates about whether the US should go to war in Iraq. Minds were all made up, of course, but I was captivated by the impressive congressional debates, including Joe Biden and others at the time. And then I was underwhelmed by the lack of curiosity amongst the political and communications advisors I met concerning what might actually happen in Iraq after an invasion, or whether indeed such an act might undermine the very international rules and norms it was being advertised as protecting. In one meeting in the Pentagon, I voiced the opinion that if the opposition in Australia won government, that is, if the Labor Party was to win government in the early 2000s, it was not in office at that time, that it would not support the US abrogating international law in Iraq, and that Australia, like other US allies, had to preserve its right to point out when the US made mistakes. It did not go down well at all, and I was lectured in chilling terms about how I should take back to the Australian opposition a warning that it would put the alliance at risk if Australia did not do what it was required to do. They were the words. In late 2019, on another visit to the US, this time to attend a conference on Chinese globalisation, I encountered the dismay of Americans that Australia had become too dependent on China, and witnessed claims that Australia would have to choose sides in the coming Cold War. At the time of writing this book, which was a few years ago now, before the change of government in Australia that occurred a few years ago, but at the time of writing this book, it certainly seemed that those warnings had come to pass, with the Australian government of the time demonstratively having chosen a side, following the seismic shock of the first Trump presidency, but also, in no small part, reinforced by China's clumsy economic coercion to express its displeasure at Australia's starring role in the new narratives about a China threat in the COVID-19 era. All of which is a circle of mutually constitutive elements of geopolitics and domestic politics that cannot, in my experience, be reduced to a black and white account. But the complexity of these problems doesn't stop the simplistic populist narrative from being broadcast daily about Chinese influence and Australian dependence. Meanwhile, actually, it's more complicated than that, right? Australia still enjoys its massive trade surplus with China while deepening its strategic relationship with the United States at the same time. It seems it is possible, after all, to walk and to chew gum at the same time. Grand strategic debates about taking sides in a new Cold War appear for now to have, though, a firm grip on the popular narrative, in particular, I would say, in the mainstream media, and it may be why people come to YouTube or other places to hear other views. Yet these grand debates about taking sides occur at a level of abstraction distant from real people, from relationships, from networks, from businesses doing business, and organisations that conduct interactions amongst the majority of the world's population in Asia. In that region, we've seen plenty of power disputes and conflicts in the past, to be sure, at the same time as deepening economic interdependence. Over the years, I formed many friendships with business people academics, artists, government officials and non-profit workers in Asia, chatting over beers, sometimes over banquets, about the things that actually trouble them, more than these narratives from imperial capitals. Matters such as expectations of long hours of work, demands of traditional family expectations, soaring real estate prices. There were so many things these people had in common with my peers in Australia, or with my relatives in America, or my colleagues in Europe, but also some things that were so different. In particular, life has been transformed in Asia in one generation. The change in Asia is unlike the marginal changes for most people in Central Europe since 1989, or the China-fueled surge in wealth for some people in Australia. The life changes in Asia in the last generation have constituted a total transformation. The Asian middle class has arrived as the largest middle class in the world, with aspirations for peace and for prosperity, along with expectations of travel, higher education, all the trappings of a global jet set. Yet in Washington and Brussels, the debate about Asia is often framed as all about normative political values. We're supposed to distrust Asian countries that have not yet followed a liberal democratic transition, although those that have often retain many of the trappings of the former state-centric and communitarian values that are alien to the West. Does it bother the newly rich people in Shenzhen or Ho Chi Minh City that they do not enjoy multi-party liberal democracies? Well, for some, yes. For others, it is the price to be paid for peace and stability over the alternative, which many fear might be chaos at this point in their development. Some detest the corruption of the state. Others long for the state to protect people better from the unscrupulous tech companies and exploitative workplaces. There is a tolerance of the ambiguity in holding both views. Life in Asia is complicated indeed, but to be sure, members of the new middle class have dramatically more agency in their daily lives than their parents had. Politics and economics are not proceeding according to the anticipated post-1989 end of history theory. It's just not a linear script. Though with China's rise is creating this widespread anxiety beyond its borders, and indeed even within its borders in cities on its periphery. I remain interested to look beyond this anxiety to figure out how can we live with a stronger China. Now, I'm going to leave it there today, but I'll come back next time and continue reading from these introductory pages before moving into the chapters that delve into aspects of China's economic and other integration into the global economy and the global system, the international system. I hope you enjoy and look forward to seeing you next time.